The city of Chicago shimmered under a blanket of mist that night. The rain had stopped an hour ago, but puddles still glistened on the cracked sidewalks like fragments of broken mirrors, reflecting the distant glow of streetlights. From the grand marble steps of the Ambassador Hotel, billionaire Richard Harlow stepped into the cool night air, tugging at his bow tie. The gala behind him, a charity event in his name, had been filled with praise, polite smiles, and fake laughter. He had written a check with more zeros than he could remember, yet he couldn't shake the hollow feeling gnawing inside his chest. Richard Harlow was a man who had everything: wealth, reputation, and influence. But lately, all those things felt meaningless. For years, he had built empires, bought companies, and crushed competitors. Success had become a habit, not a purpose. And tonight, surrounded by socialites sipping champagne while pretending to care about the poor, he felt like an imposter in his own life. So he left early, ignoring the pleas of his chauffeur to wait for the car. He wanted silence. Solitude. A few blocks of peace. He turned into Halsted Alley, a narrow shortcut between two old brick buildings. The street was half lit by a flickering lamp, the kind that hummed like a dying insect. Somewhere in the distance, a cat hissed and darted across a dumpster. He walked slowly, his polished shoes clicking on wet pavement, his breath turning into thin clouds. Behind him, a shadow moved. Then another. At first, Richard ignored it. He was used to being watched, by reporters, photographers, and bodyguards. But this felt different. The footsteps behind him didn't fade, they multiplied. When he reached the middle of the alley, he stopped and turned. 3 men emerged from the darkness. They were dressed in black hoodies and cheap gloves, their faces half covered by masks. The tallest one stepped forward, a jagged scar running down his cheek. "Evening, Mr. Harlow," he said, his voice calm, too calm. "Didn't expect to see you walking alone." Richard frowned. "What do you want? Money?" The man laughed, a low, bitter laugh. "Money? You already took ours." Then it clicked. The voices, the anger in their eyes, these weren't random muggers. They were former employees of Harlow Industries, one of his companies that had shut down 2 years ago. Hundreds had lost their jobs overnight. He remembered signing the order himself, thinking it was just business. Now, business had come for him. Before he could speak, one of the men lunged. Richard tried to step back, but a fist slammed into his stomach. He gasped, doubling over as another blow struck his jaw. The world spun, pain bloomed across his face. They shoved him against the wall, demanding apologies that couldn't heal anything. "You ruined families," one shouted. "You made us beg for food." Richard tried to reason with them, but his voice came out weak and slurred. I didn't know." "You didn't care." The scarred man snapped, pulling a metal pipe from under his jacket. He raised it high, the reflection of the streetlight glinting off its edge. Richard closed his eyes, expecting the end. The only sounds were the men's heavy breathing and the soft drip of water from a nearby gutter. The alley had no witnesses, no security cameras, no one to call for help. The billionaire who had owned half the city now lay powerless in its filth, bleeding and terrified. And just when the pipe began to fall, a faint metallic clink echoed from the far end of the alley. It wasn't loud, but sharp enough to make the men pause. A small object rolled across the wet ground, a baseball. Its leather surface was scuffed, its stitching faded, but it landed perfectly between the attackers and their victim. None of them knew it yet, but that single ball, thrown by a girl they hadn't even seen, was about to change everything. On the other side of that same street, beyond the shadows of the alley and the noise of downtown traffic, Ava Johnson stood alone in an empty parking lot. The flickering light from a broken street lamp barely illuminated the old baseball diamond she had turned into her nightly escape. Her backpack sat open beside her, a pair of scuffed sneakers poking out, and in her hand, her most prized possession, a worn-out baseball her late father had given her years ago. Ava was 14, small for her age but strong in spirit. Life had forced her to grow up early. Her mother, Monique, worked 2 shifts at a diner to keep them afloat after her father, Darius Johnson, passed away in a construction accident 3 years ago. He'd once been a talented pitcher in the minor leagues, and every evening before bed, he used to tell her, "Ava, don't ever throw with fear. Throw with purpose." Those words lived in her bones. Now, as she stood in the damp night, she wound up her arm and hurled the ball at a cracked brick wall. It hit the same fated spot again and again, a rhythm she used to drown out the world's noise, the arguing neighbors, the city sirens, the worry in her mother's tired eyes. Each throw was her way of fighting back against everything she couldn't control. She bent down, picked up the ball again, and whispered to herself, "One more perfect pitch." She wound up and released. The ball flew with a satisfying thwack, echoing through the narrow streets, and rolled away into the darkness. That's when she heard it. At first, she thought it was another drunk yelling somewhere nearby. But then came a different sound, a cry, short and sharp, followed by the heavy thud of something hitting metal. Her body stiffened. That wasn't laughter. It was fear. Curiosity tugged at her harder than common sense. She picked up her backpack, tiptoed closer to the sound, and peered through a gap in the chain-link fence separating her lot from Halstead Alley. Her heart skipped. A man in a dark suit was on his knees, surrounded by 3 others, one holding a pipe. The victim's face was bloodied, his hands trembling as he tried to push himself away. Ava's first instinct was to run, to hide, to pretend she hadn't seen anything. She was just a kid. What could she possibly do? But then she saw something familiar in that man's eyes. Helplessness. The same look her mother had when the bills piled up or when people treated them like they were invisible. That look broke something open inside Ava. Her hand went to her pocket. The ball. She gripped it tightly, her pulse pounding so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. Her father's voice echoed in her head again, "Throw with purpose." She took a deep breath, set her feet the way her father had taught her, left foot forward, elbow high, eyes locked on target. Her palms were sweaty, her knees shaking, but her focus sharpened until all she could see was the man with the pipe. "Please," she whispered to herself, "let this one count." The moment stretched, silent except for the sound of rain dripping from a gutter. Then she threw. The ball cut through the night air like lightning, fast, precise, and deadly accurate. It struck the man's wrist with a loud crack. He howled in pain, dropping the pipe instantly. The other 2 spun around, confused, searching for where it came from. Ava ducked behind the fence, heart hammering, barely believing what she'd just done. The ball had rolled back into the light, landing perfectly beside the fallen billionaire. None of them, not the attackers, not Richard Harlow himself, yet knew who had thrown it. But that single throw had just shifted the balance of fate in the dark alley. And Ava Johnson, the girl no one ever noticed, was about to become the hero no one expected. The metal pipe clattered against the ground, its echo slicing through the night air. The 3 attackers froze for a heartbeat, startled by the sound and the pain that had come from nowhere. The tallest one, the man with the scar, cursed loudly and clutched his wrist. "What the?" he yelled, staggering backward. The billionaire, Richard Harlow, blinked in confusion, blood still dripping from the corner of his mouth. He didn't understand what had just happened, only that the brutal swing meant to crush his skull had never landed. A baseball rolled to a stop near his shoe. For a second, nobody moved. It seemed almost absurd, a clean white ball lying in the middle of the grimy alley, glistening under the dim light. One of the men bent down to pick it up, but before his fingers touched it, another object flew from the shadows, this time a rock, and struck him square in the forehead. He yelped in pain, stumbling back. "Who's out there?" the scarred man shouted, spinning toward the darkness. "Show yourself." Silence. Ava crouched behind the chain-link fence, heart racing so hard she could barely breathe. Her body trembled, but her hands were steady. She saw one of them pull a knife and step toward where she was hiding. Panic surged through her. She had nothing left to throw but a broken brick. Her mind screamed to run, but she remembered her father's words again, "You don't back down when someone's in danger. Not if you can do something about it." So she grabbed the brick, took aim, and hurled it with all her strength. The man ducked, the brick shattered against the wall, but it was enough to distract him. From behind the alley, the faint wail of police sirens began to rise. Someone nearby must have called after hearing the commotion. The attackers glanced at each other, their confidence cracking. "Cops," one hissed. The scarred man snarled and kicked Richard hard in the ribs before growling, "This isn't over, Harlow. You'll pay one way or another." Then he turned and ran, followed by the others, their footsteps fading into the maze of streets. Richard stayed on the ground for a moment, gasping for breath, his body aching from the blows. When he finally looked up, he caught a flash of movement, a small figure darting away from the fence. "Wait!" he croaked, but his voice was too weak. The girl was gone. Moments later, two police cruisers pulled up, red and blue lights painting the alley walls in sharp color. Officers rushed to his side, shouting questions, helping him to his feet. One of them found a baseball near his shoe and held it up. "This yours?" he asked. Richard shook his head slowly. "No," he said, staring at the ball with disbelief. "That saved my life." He didn't even know who had thrown it, but he knew the throw hadn't come from luck, it came from skill. A perfect pitch, fast and focused. Whoever that was, she had saved him with precision that only came from training, or maybe, from heart. As the officers led him toward the waiting ambulance, Richard looked around one last time. Beyond the flashing lights, at the edge of the alley, he thought he saw her, a slim silhouette standing half-hidden under a street lamp. She hesitated, watching him, and for a brief second, their eyes met. Hers were wide and alert, a mix of fear and determination. Then she turned and vanished into the shadows. That moment stayed with him, more than the pain, more than the attack. Later, as he sat in the back of the ambulance, bandaged and dazed, he whispered to himself, "Who was that girl?" He didn't know it yet, but that question would soon become the turning point of his life. Because the mysterious girl with the perfect throw wasn't just his savior, she was about to become the reason he would change everything he believed about power, kindness, and redemption. The next morning, the city buzzed with news about the alleyway attack. Headlines read, "Billionaire Richard Harlow survives attempted robbery, assailants still at large." Reporters speculated wildly, but the truth was stranger than any of them could imagine. No one could explain the mysterious baseball found at the scene, nor how it had stopped three armed men from killing one of the most powerful figures in Chicago. From the sterile quiet of a private hospital suite, Richard Harlow watched the news replay the story again and again. His ribs ached, his lip was split, and one eye was swollen, but none of that bothered him. His mind kept circling back to that moment, the throw, the sound it made, the girl he'd glimpsed in the distance, eyes bright with courage. He couldn't shake it. When Detective Ruiz came in to take his statement, Richard interrupted halfway through. "Detective," he said, "find the person who threw that ball." Ruiz raised an eyebrow. "Sir, with respect, we're focusing on the attackers." "I'm telling you," Richard insisted, "someone saved my life. I saw her, a girl, maybe 14 or 15. She was hiding near the fence. She's the reason I'm alive." The detective scribbled something on his notepad. "We'll look into it." But Richard didn't wait for them. 2 days later, dressed in plain clothes and ignoring his doctor's advice, he returned to the alley with one of his security men. They scoured the surrounding streets, and eventually came upon an empty lot covered in graffiti and broken glass. There, he saw a brick wall peppered with faded marks, the kind made by a ball hitting the same spot hundreds of times. On the ground nearby lay a tattered baseball glove. Richard picked it up gently, feeling the worn leather. It was small, clearly a child's. "She practices here," he murmured. "Whoever she is, this is her place." That night, he gave his assistant a new task: contact every youth sports program in the city, every public school baseball coach, every community center. He wanted to find her, the girl with the arm of an athlete and the heart of a hero. 3 days later, his assistant brought him a file. "There's one girl who matches, sir," she said. "Ava Johnson. Age 14. Lives with her mother in Southside. Top pitcher in her school's team, though she couldn't join this year. They couldn't afford the fees." Richard stared at the photo in the file. The same face from that night, determined, kind, but tired beyond her years. That evening, he drove to the South Side himself, ignoring his security team's warnings. The neighborhood was poor: cracked sidewalks, flickering lights, kids playing with makeshift toys. When he knocked on the Johnson's small apartment door, a woman in a diner uniform answered, wary and confused. "Mrs. Johnson?" he asked politely. "I'm Richard Harlow. I think your daughter saved my life." Monique blinked, unsure if she'd heard correctly. "I'm sorry. What?" Just then, Ava stepped into the hallway, clutching her old baseball glove. Her eyes widened when she saw him, the man from the alley, clean and composed now, but instantly recognizable. "You," she whispered. "Yes," Richard said softly, a smile tugging at his bruised lips. "You threw that ball." Ava hesitated. "I didn't mean to, I heard them. I wanted to help." Richard's voice broke slightly. "You did more than help. You saved my life." Monique covered her mouth in disbelief. Ava just looked down, shy and unsure what to say. Richard took a deep breath. "I'd like to thank you properly. And if you'll let me, I want to make sure you never have to worry about giving up baseball again." That moment, in a small, worn-out hallway, marked the beginning of something neither of them expected. A billionaire had met his savior. And a girl from the streets was about to see her life change forever. The story of the mysterious girl with the baseball spread through Chicago like wildfire. News anchors replayed it every hour, social media exploded with theories, and people everywhere were talking about how a teenage girl had saved a billionaire with one perfect throw. Yet while the city buzzed with excitement, Ava Johnson stayed quiet. She didn't tell her classmates. She didn't brag. She just kept going to school, helping her mother, and practicing throws against that same cracked wall. But someone else hadn't forgotten: Richard Harlow. After meeting Ava and her mother, something inside him had shifted. For years, he lived behind glass towers and gated walls, disconnected from the world his decisions affected. But when he looked at Ava, a girl who had so little yet gave so much, he saw everything he had lost: humility, courage, and heart. A week later, reporters surrounded his office building when he made a surprise public announcement. Standing behind a podium, Richard spoke with an emotion that shocked even his employees. "Last week," he began, "I learned that bravery doesn't come from power, but from compassion. A young girl risked her life to save mine. She didn't know who I was. She didn't do it for money or fame. She did it because it was right. And today, I want to honor that." He announced the creation of the Darius Johnson Foundation, named after Ava's late father, a youth sports program designed to fund athletic scholarships for underprivileged kids across the city. The foundation's first full scholarship would go to Ava Johnson herself. When the cameras flashed, Ava's hands trembled as she stood beside him, wearing her best borrowed dress. She didn't like crowds, but when Richard handed her a brand new leather glove, she smiled shyly and whispered, "Thank you." He leaned down and replied softly, "No, Ava. Thank you. You reminded me what being human means." The story of the mysterious girl with the baseball spread through Chicago like wildfire. News anchors replayed it every hour, social media exploded with theories, and people everywhere were talking about how a teenage girl had saved a billionaire with one perfect throw. Yet while the city buzzed with excitement, Ava Johnson stayed quiet. She didn't tell her classmates. She didn't brag. She just kept going to school, helping her mother, and practicing throws against that same cracked wall. But someone else hadn't forgotten, Richard Harlow. After meeting Ava and her mother, something inside him had shifted. For years, he lived behind glass towers and gated walls, disconnected from the world his decisions affected. But when he looked at Ava, a girl who had so little yet gave so much, he saw everything he had lost: humility, courage, and heart. A week later, reporters surrounded his office building when he made a surprise public announcement. Standing behind a podium, Richard spoke with an emotion that shocked even his employees. "Last week," he began, "I learned that bravery doesn't come from power, but from compassion. A young girl risked her life to save mine. She didn't know who I was. She didn't do it for money or fame. She did it because it was right. And today, I want to honor that." He announced the creation of the Darius Johnson Foundation, named after Ava's late father, a youth sports program designed to fund athletic scholarships for underprivileged kids across the city. The foundation's first full scholarship would go to Ava Johnson herself. When the cameras flashed, Ava's hands trembled as she stood beside him, wearing her best borrowed dress. She didn't like crowds, but when Richard handed her a brand new leather glove, she smiled shyly and whispered, "Thank you." He leaned down and replied softly, "No, Ava. Thank you. You reminded me what being human means." The foundation launch changed more than just Ava's life. Within months, hundreds of kids across Chicago were receiving new equipment, uniforms, and chances they never dreamed of. Richard personally visited community centers, shaking hands with parents and coaches, learning names, listening to stories. The same man once known for ruthless business deals became known for rebuilding dreams. Meanwhile, Ava's talent flourished. With proper training and new gear, she joined a city-level team and quickly became known for her precision pitching. Reporters called her the lightning arm. Coaches began to whisper about college scouts watching from the stands. But fame never distracted her. Every time she threw, she still whispered her father words: "Throw with purpose." One crisp spring evening, Richard and Monique sat together in the bleachers at a local game, watching Ava take the mound. The sun dipped low, painting the field in shades of gold. Richard's suit looked out of place among the crowd, but his smile was genuine. When Ava wound up and released the ball, it whistled through the air and slammed into the catcher's mitt with a sharp, perfect thwack. The umpire called, "Strike 3," and the crowd erupted in cheers. Richard looked at Monique and said quietly, "That sound. That's the sound of hope." Monique smiled through tears. "You gave her that hope?" He shook his head. "No. She gave it to me first." After the game, Ava ran up to him, beaming, her glove tucked under her arm. "Did you see that pitch?" she asked. He laughed, eyes shining. "I did. And you just proved that night wasn't luck, it was destiny." Ava grinned. "Guess that throw really did change everything." Richard nodded slowly, looking at the girl who had saved his life and unknowingly rescued his soul. "Yes," he said softly. "It did. For both of us." And as the stadium lights glowed above them, Ava threw her ball high into the night sky, a symbol of strength, courage, and the beautiful twist of fate that had united two lives forever.